Hey guys, in this video we're going to set up a new server on AWS and then configure it to support running a MERN Stack application. Then we're going to deploy an example MERN Stack application to it so we can see that everything's been installed correctly and we can see it up and running. Now, a MERN Stack application is an app which includes a front end that's built in React and a backend API that's built with Node.js, Express, and MongoDB, which is what gives it its name. As you can see here, Mongo, Express, React, and Node. As usual with my other videos, I've created a blog post with all of the steps that we're going to be going through, which you can see here, and I'll link to it in the video description. The front-end React app and the back-end Node.js API we won't cover in detail that we're using in this video. I won't cover in detail in the video, but they are covered in detail in a couple of other posts which are linked to here. So the example app that we're going to be using supports user registration and login functionality. What we'll be covering today is first we'll be creating an server from scratch on AWS via the AWS console. Then we'll connect to that server using SSH. We'll install all of the things that we need for running a MERN Stack application. That's Node.js MongoDB, and we'll be using NGINX as well as a couple other things that you'll see. Then we'll deploy the example Node.js and MongoDB backend API. Then deploy the React Redux frontend app and build that app. Then we'll configure NGINX as the gateway web server for both of the front and the back end, so they can both be run on the same port 80 or HTTP. Then we'll test accessing the app via a browser. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. So the first thing you'll need to do before starting is you need to have an AWS account. So you can access the AWS console by following the link in the post here. If you don't have an account, you can click Create New Account. Otherwise, you can sign into the console. I've already signed in previously. Also, what we're doing at the moment, the first step is to actually just create the new server. So we'll be running our MERN Stack app on a Linux server running Ubuntu 18.04. Okay, the next step is to go to the EC2 service section. So you can click that there. And the next step is to launch instance. So click the launch instance button. After that, we want to choose the AMI, or the Amazon Machine Image. That's where we select that we want Ubuntu 18.04 to run. So to filter the list of AMIs running, we only want the ones that are eligible for free tier, so we don't get charged. And we want to enter Ubuntu and enter, and it should be the first option in those filtered results. So Ubuntu Server 18.04, click select, and make sure the size of the instance is T2 micro and it has the green free tier eligible underneath it there. Next, you can click Configure Security Group on the top menu. The other sections here, you can leave all the defaults selected. In the security group, we're going to be adding a rule to allow HTTP traffic through to the server, so we can test our application in a browser. The other type of traffic that's allowed through the security group is SSH traffic, which we'll be using to connect to the server so we can configure it. So select that and then click Review and Launch. Okay, on the review page it shows the settings that we've selected. So the operating system there, the instance type, and the security group settings. And click Launch. Okay, so then what you need to do is create a key pair for connecting to the AWS instance. This is already highlighted because I've previously created a key pair called my AWS key, but I'll create another new one just so you can see how that's done. So the key that you'll be using is in order to connect to the server securely with SSH. So you can name the key pair anything you like. I use the name my AWS key, so I'll just call this one my AWS key 2. Click download key pair, and you can see that's the private key that's downloaded. Once that's done, click launch instance, and you can see that the instance is launching. And if you scroll down and click the view instances button, you can see the state is pending, and that should be up and running shortly. And we can see what our next step is. So the next step will be to connect to our EC2 instance via SSH. Before we do that, as I mentioned before, we'll be using the private key file we created, but before we can use the key, we need to set the permissions on it so it's not publicly viewable. So we need to set the permissions using this command, change mod 400, and then the path to the key file, and that makes the private key file not publicly accessible, so SSH won't complain about it. I should note here as well that I'm running on a Mac. If you're using Windows, you'll need to use PuTTY to connect via SSH, and you can find instructions for that in the AWS docs by following this link, and those instructions are there. Once you've connected via PuTTY, the rest of the tutorial is all connected to the server via SSH, so it remains the same. So this is the only difference between Mac and Windows. So if we run that command, so we'll open a terminal window first, and if we type chmod, set it to 400, and I know my key pair has been downloaded into the downloads directory. So the one that I selected was my key 2, so I'll set that there. So that would have updated. That's all you need to do to update the permissions on that file. And the next thing you need to do to connect via SSH is copy the public domain name from the instance description in AWS, and then enter the command ssh-i, enter the path to your key file, then the username Ubuntu and the domain name of the server. So first I'll type the start of that. So if you type the ssh command -i and the path to our key file, my AWS key 2, and Ubuntu and then let's go to our instance, which should be ready. And in our instance description tab, we can see our public domain name here called public DNS IPv4. We can copy it to the clipboard there. And if we go back and paste it to that command, hit enter, and enter yes here that we want to add it to our list of known hosts. And that's it, we're now connected to the server. So let's see what's next. Alright, so next we actually want to set up the tools that we need for running a MERN Stack app. So we want to install Node.js MongoDB and NGINX on the server. Now I won't go into the details of how to install each of these things separately, because I've created a separate blog post previously that goes into that shows how to do that. So you can access that via this link here. All we'll be doing in this video is I've got the entire script for installing all of these things available as a gist on GitHub, which you can run using this line here. If you're interested in, as I said, knowing the details of it, you can just go to that post and check out the details and the descriptions and follow that there. But for now, let's go back to our terminal, enter the curl command, and you can see that first Node is installing, then MongoDB, and PM2, which is a process manager for managing Node.js applications, and NGINX, which is the web server that we're going to be using as the entry point to our server, and also a firewall is installed. Okay, that's done. So our server is now ready. We can move to the next step, which is deploying our backend Node.js plus MongoDB API. So the first step is to clone our Node and Mongo API project into the opt/backend folder with this command here. So it's just cloning it from GitHub. So you can enter that there. That's done. And we want to cd into the folder and install all of the Node package dependencies. Okay, that's done. Finally, we want to tell PM2 to start the server and manage that process for us. Now, the reason we're using PM2 to manage the process, if I can highlight this thing here. The reason we're using PM2 rather than calling Node directly is that if you're running a Node.js process directly and there's an error, it stops, it basically crashes, whereas if you're running in production, that's not what you want to happen. So you can run production Node applications under PM2, and it will keep things up and running even if there's an error or something like that. And it will also run things. You can set them to run on startup, which is what this command does. So if you do PM2 start server, you can see that that server, which is the name of our API process, is running now on the server. Okay. Next step is to deploy the React and Redux front-end app. So we'll do the same thing with cloning the project from GitHub, and this will put into the /opt/frontend directory. Okay, and then again we'll cd into the directory and install all of the Node package dependencies. Okay, while it's doing that, we'll see the next step. Okay, so the next step is we'll be editing a couple of the files, because by default the example React app runs without a backend. It runs with a fake backend. So we'll be disabling that functionality, so it will send backend requests through to our actual API, and we'll be updating the URL of the API to point to /API, which is what will be pointed to our API. So in order to edit, we'll be using the Nano editor, text editor on Linux, which is on the server, and in order to disable the fake backend on the example app that's set in the source index.jsx, we'll just delete these 3 lines in that file. So going back to terminal, to that command, and here we have our index.jsx, and if you use Control K you can delete or cut lines, and Control X to save the file, hit Y for yes, and enter to save over the same file name. Okay, then the next thing is to update the Webpack config to set the API URL. The default API URL in the Webpack config is set up for when you're running the example locally, so it's set to point to localhost 4000, which is where the API runs when you're running it locally. So we'll change that to /API. So /API, and then Control X to save, Y for yes, and enter. And then we'll build our React app by calling npm run build. So while that's happening as well, we'll see what happens next. So the React app should be built into the /op/frontend/dist directory. So that's done. So if we check, we should have a dist directory here, and there's our built files there. So that's worked successfully. Next step is to configure NGINX. Okay, so as I mentioned, the API runs when it starts. It runs on port 4000, and by default, when you're running the React and the React front end and the Node back end on your local machine, the React front end you can use the Webpack dev server or something like that to run the React app on one port, and that can talk to the API on port 4000, so you can have them running on separate ports on your dev machine. That's fine in development, but when you're running in production, you want them to both be accessible via the same port. And in this case, we want them accessible on HTTP, which is port 80. In order to make that happen, we're going to be running NGINX as the gateway web server. That'll be running on port 80, and it will be set up to serve the React app from the root directory or from the root path /path, and any requests beginning with /API, we will proxy those through to our API, our Node.js API, which is running internally on port 4000. So the way to configure NGINX to do that is to have a server block like this. This one's set up to catch as a catch-all server block for any requests that come to this server, using this server name _, which is just a catch-all for any requests or any host names. And these are the two location rules. This location /API says that any requests with a prefix of /API get proxied through to localhost 4000, which is our API. And any other requests that start with a /, which is any other request, set to the root directory of our React app, which is opt frontend dist, and they're set to return either our React static files matching the URL, or if they don't match any URL, it returns the root index.html file of the React app, which then handles the routing and everything else client side. Okay, so in order to configure NGINX in this way, the first thing we'll do is remove the default NGINX config file with this command. And then we will recreate a new NGINX default config file using the nano text editor. And we can copy in our config here. And then again, Control X, Y, and enter. And finally, in order for NGINX to use the updated config, we will restart the NGINX server. Paste in that command, enter. Also, if you're interested in finding out more about the NGINX config, there are details below with a reference to everything that's used and links off to the NGINX documentation. Okay, so that's everything done. The last thing for us to do is actually test our application running. So if we go back to our instance in AWS and grab the domain name, if we open a new tab and paste that in there, if we've done everything right, we should see our test application. Okay, and there it is. We can see that it's up and running. If we open up our dev tools and see the network tab and try to register a user, register, we can see that that has gone to the API, register, and it looks like our registration's been successful. So if we then log in, alright, looks like everything is working. So that's all we have. That's how you set up a server on AWS to support a MERN Stack application, and that's how you deploy a MERN Stack application to it. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe to my channel below. Okay, cheers.